And now I would like to introduce our next speaker on the symposium, Dr. Shawn L. Williams. Dr. Williams earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and also in African Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He holds a Master of Arts in Reading Curriculum and a Doctor of Arts in Humanities with a focus on English literature from Clark Atlanta University. Dr. Williams has written several essays in the fields of African American studies and literacy education. He has lectured and conducted workshops on topics such as nurturing language development in young children, public school curriculum and policy, testing, literacy curriculum development, multiculturalism, gender politics, and Africana cultural studies. In other words, he's a heavyweight. He's the author of I'm a Bad Man, African American Vernacular Culture and the Making of Muhammad Ali, and this is his book, which I'm sure he will be happy to have you purchase. Last year, Dr. Williams was the recipient of the Writers Institute Fellowship here at Georgia Perimeter College. He is currently working on 2 book projects, Race Babbling, Racism in Post-Racial America, and Why Johnny Doesn't Read, Even If He Knows How, Understanding Illiteracy and Bibliophobia. Please help me welcome our own Dr. Shawn Williams.
Good morning. Good morning. Glad to see a nice crowd. I guess a lot of our committee members had classes, so for me a nice audience. Thank you. My topic today is Willie Lynch Syndrome. So there was not a mistype on the schedule. It is Willie Lynch Syndrome, the consequences of mythologizing history. And I had other ideas of what I would deal with for this symposium. And then I thought about dealing with the Willie Lynch syndrome, the Willie Lynch story, the Willie Lynch character. And I was thinking, well, a lot of people may already know about that. But then I saw a clip from this movie here that some of you may have seen that I'll show you real quick. The Great Debaters, which was Denzel Washington's second film, that is, of the films that he made. And in this scene, the character he's playing is a historical character. I think his first name, Melvin Tolson. And as some of you should know, when Hollywood does a movie on historical characters, everyone should keep in mind that they are not history recollections, right? They are stories, they are fictionalized stories based on history, and based on historical characters. But this is a really powerful scene that made me think about, I have to really talk about this Willie Lynch thing. And so let me share this with you. Okay, how many of you have heard of Willie Lynch? Raise your hand, you heard of Willie Lynch, okay. For a lot of people, when people think of slavery, they think of Willie Lynch. And so that's why I thought it was really important to talk about this to give a scholarly perspective on that discussion. That scene, by the way, that in that film was not a part of the original script as it was written, but Denzel, as the director of the film, decided to have that scene integrated in it, and that dialogue integrated in it, because he felt that was an important message to bring across. The Willie Lynch letter, sometimes referred to as the Willie Lynch letter or the Willie Lynch speech, is probably the most prolific, the most widely disseminated thing on the internet. And it's if you go and you do a search, put in Willie Lynch's name, you'll get 610,000 hits. And all of them will be in reference to what you're looking for. So it is widely disseminated. And here's one such site. I'm going to mute it because it has this irritating version of a song that I like, but it's really irritating. But this is one of the sites with Talking Drum. And this is the information that is included in here about this speech and about Willie Lynch. It says, and this is on just about every site you'll find this information. This speech was delivered by Willie Lynch of the bank of the James River in the colony of Virginia in 1712. Lynch was a British slave owner in the West Indies. And as Denzel Washington said in the film, you would hear this is also included. The term lynching is derived from his name. Okay? Now, that is the extent of that information that you'll find about his speech. I'm going to come back to that in a second, but let's look at the context of it. Basically, what the subtitle of the speech is the making of a slave. And in this speech, Willie Lynch is supposed to be speaking to some slave owners in Virginia and telling them about methods to control their slaves. And he talks about fomenting division among the enslaved Africans so that they could be at odds with one another and therefore be more easily controlled. And the impression one gets from this is that the division that exists among African Americans, and which, by the way, there are no greater divisions among African Americans than there are about any other group. But in the minds of a lot of African Americans, we do tend to think that there are a great deal of divisions. And people look to this Willie Lynch document as the cause of all this. It's proof of the cause of all this. And one of the other messages in here that is somewhat troubling for different reasons is there's a section here that talks about, let me blow it up just a little bit. There's a section that talks about the black woman. And it says that in this speech, he is supposedly saying to the slave masters that in order to control black men and women, it is you have to, as he puts it, reverse their roles. Okay, and here's a portion that says, take the female, run a series of tests on her, see if she will submit to your desires willingly, test her in every way, because she's the most important factor in good economics. Let me move on. And do not hesitate to use the bullwhip on her to extract the last bit of the word out of it. By the way, as I showed my class, for those of you students, when someone transcribes something and you replace it with your own words, like here this person uses the word because they didn't want to use a derogatory term. It's supposed to put brackets around it. But a lot of these sites that retranscribe this thing, they didn't put brackets on it, a few of them. And that's what you're not supposed to do. So as an English instructor, I'm obligated by law to point that out. But, okay, he says, we have reversed the relationship in her natural uncivilized state. In her natural uncivilized state, there's a missing something there. She would have a strong dependency on the uncivilized inward male. It's a funny way right there. Uncivilized male, and she would have a limited protective tendency toward her independent male offspring and would raise male offspring to be dependent like her. Nature had provided for this type of balance. We reverse nature by burning and pulling a civilized inward apart, pulling the word apart, and bullwhipping the other to the point of death. I'm laughing at the wording. I'm sorry. That's probably not the right thing to do right now. But where was I? We reversed the relationship, and then we said, we reversed nature by burning and pulling him apart and whipping the other to the point of death, all in her presence, and her being left alone, unprotected, with the male image destroyed, that's in bold letters there. The ordeal caused her to move from her psychological dependent state to a frozen independent state. Now, one of the things that struck me as strange about this is the type of language that is used here. Now, this is supposed to be a slave owner talking to some Virginia slave owners, basically someone talking to farmers, right? And he's talking about frozen, independent, psychological states and so forth. But anyway, with the male image destroyed. This rose a psychological state of independence. She will raise her male and female offspring in reverse roles. For fear of the young man's life, she will psychologically train him to be mentally weak, independent, and physically strong. Because she has become psychologically independent, she would train her female offspring, that should be one word, no S, to be psychologically independent. What have you got? You've got the inward woman out front and the inward man behind and scared. Right? So if one is to believe this, then what he's saying is that by beating on men and demasculating men in front of the woman, he destroys her image and also leaves the woman with no one to depend upon but herself, right? And then she teaches her daughter to be a strong and independent because she can't rely on the broken male, right? And so he, in turn, the male will be, she will be overprotective of the male, and he will be overdependent on him and weak. Physically strong, but weak, right? So we have a word for that, a colloquial term that we use nowadays. We call that a mama's boy, right? So basically it's talking about the creation of mama's boys and all that. So now, elsewhere in the very beginning of this thing, Willie Lynch says that these methods will have an impact that will last hundreds of years. If you do this right, it'll last hundreds of years, right? So if that's so, then this man has to be and if it's true that this perceived situation that we see today, like in the minds of many people, black women are in a much stronger position than African American men, right? They tend to be more independent and so forth. And notice I said that's the perception. In actuality, that is not quite true. Still, African American women collectively do make less than everyone else, right? But there's the impression, and we can see the reason for that impression. You look around college campuses, and we see such a lack of African American men in the classrooms, right? So we're under the impression that, and shortly, black men have historically caught hell, still catching hell too. But what we're missing out on, we're missing the point that so too are African American women. But the perception is that women are doing their thing, and black men have to get their thing together. And if we are to believe what this says here, it is telling us that the reason why we're in this situation is because of a plan that this man came up with in 1712. Okay. Now, here's some things you ought to look at, though. When you're looking at a historical document, right? When you're looking at any document, when you're reading things, everyone's heard the expression, don't believe everything you read, right? But what is important is that we show students, that scholars, that everyone knows how to discern something that is deceitful or not, or is fishy, from something that might be legitimate, right? So really what I'm dealing with here is a lesson in critical thinking and critical comprehension. And of course, everybody in my reading class, they know about the critical comprehension. And critical comprehension is very important. It instills in us a skill that is crucial for our everyday life. It's a skill that is the same attribute that August Wilson ascribes to one of his characters in Fences. Critical thinking, critical comprehension is, if I can paraphrase August Wilson, it is the ability to know where the shit lies and how to tell it from the alfalfa. Now, I don't really know what alfalfa is, but I do know it. I always like the poetry of that line. But that's what critical thinking is. It's ability to read through stuff. And there's some certain things we ought to be aware of. Like, first of all, this, if we look at the document, I'm going to go to this thing here. We have to consider on these websites the information that we are given about Willie Lynch. And by the way, there is a published book called Willie Lynch, The Making of a Slave. Don't write it down because I don't want you to buy it. But if you look in Essence Magazine, it is listed as one of his top-selling paperback nonfiction books. When I published my book, I said I'm going to try to make that list, and because I wanted to knock that off the list. I ain't nowhere near that right now, so do buy my book. But it's at the top of the list. Now, one of the reasons why, and that always troubled me, but one of the reasons, of course, is cheap. You can get it for $3.95. But in the book contains about the same amount of information that you will find in some of the larger websites that contain the letter, right? Because I looked at the book and I was hoping maybe there'll be something more in it than we'll find on the website. But this is the biographical information that's listed for Willie Lynch. One, he's British, a British slave owner from the West Indies. Okay, now what's wrong with that picture? Anybody from the West Indies in here? Okay, where are you from? Jamaica? Who else is from the West Indies? Where are you from? Haiti. Okay, who else? Anyone else from the West Indies? Okay. Some people have been to the West Indies, right? Been to Bahamas, So if we were to have a meeting, we were going to have a big conference, I say, hey, we're heading to the West Indies, the whole Holiday Inn, right? We can be on in 3 or 4 different countries, right? Different islands, right? So we're not given any more information about where this person comes from other than from the West Indies. And we're told lynching was derived from his name. And you heard that from Denzel Washington in that scene. And in my class, I had the class, we looked up in the dictionary, lynching. You look up in the dictionary lynching, and you will find the origin of the word. Lynching, actually, first of all, does everybody know what lynching is? What is lynching? Yes.
I thought it was when you would, like, tie it to a tree or something.
Tying someone to a tree? Okay. Anything else?
I mean,
Use a noose tool.
Huh?
Use a noose.
Using a noose? Okay. All right, one of the most famous lynchings was of whom? Emmett Till, right? Was Emmett Till hung? No, Emmett Till wasn't hung. He was beaten to death. He was tortured. He was had a lot of, but he wasn't hung, right? He was shot. Lynching does involve killing, right? What else does it involve? Torture. Anything else?
Humiliation.
Humiliation. Okay. Yes. Anything else? Mutilation. Okay. What kind of people are lynched? Black people? Okay.
Criminal.
All right, actually, if you look at the definition of lynching, you will find no reference to black people. So what lynching is, the definition of lynch is to kill someone, to kill someone through mob action illegally. Basically, it's an illegal execution. When a mob gets together and finds someone who is a criminal or at least an accused criminal, and they get together and they put him to death. Now that term actually originated from one of 2 lynches. There's a bit of dispute over the names, and haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet. But it's either a Charles Lynch or a William Lynch. Now the William Lynch that it may be named after died in 1820, right? And of course we see this name Willie Lynch. Now first of all, when I first saw the name Willie Lynch, I got suspicious because I was thinking, I don't know any white people named Willie. You know? But then I thought about groundskeeper Willie from Simpsons. I said, oh yeah, well there's him. You know? But the William Lynch was, both of those Lynch were affiliated with Virginia. Charles Lynch, I believe, was the brother of John Lynch, after whom Lynchburg, Virginia was named. But despite all the confusion about which Lynch it was named after, what was clear is that lynching came about because in a particular township, there was a lot of crime going on, and there was not an adequate police force to do anything about it. So what happened is either a person named Judge Charles Lynch decided that he justified and he supported the idea of forming posses and going out and killing anyone who commits a crime. So the first victims of these lynchings, of course, were whites, because this was a white community, right? And so lynching is just putting someone to death. Now, in the history of America, the people who have been lynched most often have been African American men. In what period of history, though, were African American men lynched? Okay, it was not during slavery. Lynching did not occur until after slavery. It really occurred mainly during the Jim Crow period, right? And I have a chart on there, maybe I'll pull it up later, but there's a chart that shows that we have 7 periods of African American history. The third is the slavery period. And because African history, by the way, African American history, which is the history of Africans in America, does not begin with slavery, by the way. It begins before slavery. Right? Africans have been in this part of the world since probably 500 BC, or at least in the Central Americas. But during the slavery period, there was no lynching. And in fact, if you read the Willie Lynch speech, one of the things that is said in there, he says you shouldn't kill your slaves, right? He said you shouldn't kill them because they're your property, and which was true. Generally, there was not much lynching of slaves during the slavery period, primarily because if you would destroy a slave, you're destroying your property, right? If you had a horse that was misbehaving, you don't shoot the horse, right? If anything, you can sell the horse, right? So killing of slaves, or enslaved Africans, I should say, was not really a common practice, right? That was like a very, very last resource to do anything else, but try to keep that property intact, right? But so really, if you look at what this Willie Lynch is saying, it doesn't make any sense that lynching would have anything to do with him, right? Because one, it's a phenomenon that doesn't have anything to do specifically with black people, right? Except that black folks were the most often lynched. Just like even today, African Americans are most often executed, right? Legally. So lynching was not derived from any Willie Lynch. In fact, it came about much later. If it's affiliated with William Lynch and Charles Lynch, it will still be placed somewhere in the 1800s, right? Which is a long time after the speech that was supposedly given in 1712, right? So when I found this and I saw that was the first thing, when I first saw this document. When I first saw this document, by the way, it wasn't online. Most people saw it the first time online. I remember seeing it in a printed form, so it was probably when it was first appeared. And when I saw that line, I said, wait a minute, lynching derived from his name, and because I understood, some history about lynching and about black folks, I knew there was something fishy. I knew that was wrong, right? And it brought to mind a proverb. There's an African proverb that says, one falsehood spoils 1,000 truths, right? Which means, if I tell a lie today, it's going to make you doubt everything that comes out of my mouth tomorrow. And in fact, it'll make you doubt everything I told you yesterday, right? So, in this case, when I found this falsehood in this document, then it should raise eyebrows. And it disturbs me that it hasn't raised that many eyebrows. But when you see something like that, well, part of the reason why it doesn't raise eyebrows is because people aren't familiar with what lynching is, right? But if you see that mistake, that falsehood in there, then you have to ask the question, okay, what else is wrong here? If you haven't noticed anything else wrong here, right? But what we are not given in any of the references to Willie Lynch, usually when someone mentions a historical figure, right, in any kind of entry of something, where you find a historical figure, what do you always have attached to his name? What do you always see? Date of birth and a date of death, right? Here, nowhere have I found anywhere where there was a date of birth or a date of death, right? Just the only date associated with him is a year 1712, and that was the year of this speech. And this is information we have regarding that speech. We're told it was delivered in 1712, quote, on the bank of the James River before Virginia slave owners, right? If someone were to ask you, when did the I Have a Dream speech, or as Professor Hawkins pointed out to us, 100 years later speech that has come to be known as I Have a Dream speech, what could you tell them? Could you tell them? Yes, you could. At least you can find it, right? If you don't remember. Who remembers when the speech was given, I Have a Dream speech?
August 28, 1963.
Very good, okay. You ought to remember that if you watch the Democratic Convention, that kind of coincided with the anniversary of that, and people were making a big deal out of that. So, yes, that's when it happened. But there's a date associated with it, right? Where did it take place? Well, I have a dream, the one that most people see the recorded version of, that one took place in Washington, D.C., right? The earlier version, we know it took place in Detroit. We know that we can find the date of that. The event that he was speaking in was what? What is it? The March on Washington, right? The March on Washington. So we not only have whenever you find, and if you find any speech, look up any speech, you're going to find when it took place. You're going to find a date, right? We don't have a date. We have a year. There's one document I've had a student come across, and it did have a date placed on it, and this was one of the later reprintings of this, and it had December 25th, 1712. I've never seen that date attached to it anywhere else, but it was attached to this one internet printing of this. And interestingly enough, there's no other reference to anything having to do with Christmas or anything on there, but it was the date December 25th. But in most documents, including the book that's published, no date, just 1712, right? And what about the location here? Right? We know that I Have a Dream was delivered in Washington, D.C., right? Do we know where this speech was delivered? On the banks of the river in James River in Virginia, right? If I tell you I got $1 million for you, but if you want it, you got to meet me in Georgia by the banks of the Chattahoochee River. I may be in Helen, Georgia. You might be in Cobb County, right? So you can be, and the map that Professor Gilead had on it, you could see the James River up there. I don't know if you noticed it, but it was a river, and you could see all of the counties that it bordered, right? So that's not a location. That's really being very broad. And now some folks may argue, I don't know if I want this up right now. Yes, I do. Some people may argue that, well, maybe when they recorded this speech, they just didn't take that down. Now, you're in 1712 recording somebody's speech. You don't have a tape recorder. You got to write it down. Right? You mean to tell me you're not going to think, well, maybe I ought to put the date on here, right? Well, maybe I should say who invited him to speak. We don't even know that he just comes. You saw in the Denzel Washington character says they had trouble with their slaves, so how they look him up? You know, their phone book, you know, he just comes up and he's on the banks of the James River, you know, and he's telling them all this stuff, right? Well, obviously, my point is this is clearly a fabricated document, right? But now, of course, the story can end there. Okay, it's fabricated. Let's move on. However, here's the problem. The problem is Denzel Washington put it in his movie. The problem is Louis Farrakhan in the Million Man March made reference to it. The problem is the other day I hear Al Sharpton and a guest make reference to the Willie Lynch Syndrome, right? The problem is that you have educated people, intelligent people even, and of course common people who make reference to this document as it is a historical record, right? And it's not. Now, is that a problem? I think it is. I think it is a problem. And the problem is, and I think it's a problem from a number of different perspectives. As a scholar, you know, I'm concerned with correctness and things like that. But it's not just the issue of having the right information. The issue is what is the consequence of even believing that it is so, right? And does it give us an understanding of slavery, right? Because, like I said, most people's understanding of slavery, they think of Willie Lynch, right? They think of division, they think of Willie Lynch, right? So, and to understand slavery and where it comes from and where all the divisiveness that we see among African Americans, where does that come from? That, by the way, is what we call when people talk about the Willie Lynch Syndrome, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about incorrigible division among African Americans, you know, basically, you know, skin color differences, skin prejudices, and all that stuff. And another symptom of the Willie Lynch Syndrome, because the syndrome, by the way, is a collection of symptoms. I don't know if people, when they say that, think about that, but they are thinking about the idea of divisiveness among African American people. And they don't talk about it as much, but it's clearly in the document. It clearly emphasized a great deal. It also, one of the problems is black women not knowing their place, right? And black women not knowing their place is because, if we believe this document is true, it's because the white man made her that way, right? So there's a lot of problems with that. First of all, there's a problem with the idea that independence among African American women is a bad thing, right? So here you find that this document is tainted with the institutional values of America, right? Which is really the source of where slavery came from, right? The survival of slavery, because sometimes we talk about the different things that follow slavery, the aftermath, certain situations that have followed even today, right? The reason why they continue is because of the institutional values that underlie slavery, right? There's another African proverb that a building, no matter how high, has to stand on something, right? And the institution of slavery was built on some core values in American society, and though slavery has disappeared, legal slavery has disappeared, those core values remain. So let me back up and talk about those core values, because this kind of is brought up here. And those core values, I refer to America's institutional value system, right? And three things. We typically call them race, sex, and classism, right? And I prefer to use the term Eurocentrism or white supremacy. We probably argue whether we want to say it, but what we're talking about the belief and practice within the notion that European culture, Western culture, the culture that we generally associate with white folks is superior to all others. Okay, that is the notion. Note that I don't have in that definition any reference to hate, because it has nothing to do with hatred. Slave owners loved their slaves. Many of them loved their slaves. They say that, they meant it, right? But the difference is that loving someone and seeing that person as a person and as a human being is not necessarily the same thing. You have people who love people and kill the people they love, right? And also, many of us love our pets, right? But that pet is still our pet, right? So love ain't got nothing to do with that, right? Or hatred has nothing to do with that. And one of the disservices we do in our discussion of race is that we focus on organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and things like that. Jerry Springer talks about, well, nobody writes Jerry Springer anymore, but I know you used to watch it. But remember he used to have shows like his, they would discuss racism. Who they have? They had the Ku Klux Klan. Say, this is racism. He pointed at that. Which is ironic because no one has really been done more destruction to the image of black people, and not just black people, but also poor people, than Jerry Springer has done with this show. With the images that they promote and perpetuate, celebrate, and just put up for our consumption. But anyway, that's one of the main principles upon which slavery was built. Right? And then you have androcentrism, also might refer to sexism, misogyny. And that's the belief and practice rooted in the notion that manhood is superior to womanhood. Right? And lastly, you have classism, which is rooted in materialism. Materialism is placing value on things, right? And classism is building a categorical structure based on that idea. In other words, we value those who have over those who have not, right? Slavery is built on these principles, especially Eurocentrism, white supremacy, and classism, right? In fact, slavery is the ultimate institutional manifestation of these ideas, right? It reduces humans to things, right? Reduces them to material, right? And no one was more reduced to a material object than the African American woman, right? And I don't get into that stuff about who caught more hell, black men or black women. That is the most ridiculous discussion ever, right? Because, and when people, they used to say, the black male is an endangered species. A male cannot be a species. A male is a species half, right? If everyone was hunting moose and they were just killing the male moose because of the bigger antlers, right? You will still wipe out the moose population, right? So it wouldn't be just the moose, the male moose who was endangered. We don't do that. But, when we talk about black people, we say, the endangered black male. You can't endanger a male, you endanger the whole species. That's a species act. But anyway, this is what we should challenge, and this is what part of what we challenge when we challenge slavery. Well, actually, the reason why some of the problems that remain in America do remain is because we really haven't gotten to the core issues, right? I mostly like Barack Obama, but he was wrong when he said that, you remember when Jeremiah Wright said something about America being rooted in racism, that it was founded upon racism. And it was funny when I saw that on Fox News, and they said, Jeremiah Wright says America founded on racism and it's still racist. I'm like, y'all ain't know that? But in his comment, and I understand, it was expedient for him to do so, and why he said that and probably maybe he believes it, but he said that he doesn't believe racism is endemic to America. It is endemic. It is deeply rooted. And in fact, one of the ironies is that the folks running for president, where are they going to live? They're going to live in a White House that was built how? You know how the White House was built? Slave labor. Slave labor built the White House. So our capital literally sits on the foundation of slavery. So for us to deny that it is rooted in our history is really just being, blind, right? Anyway, okay. Reason why I came into this is because now why is this document, the Willie Lynch letter, disseminated? Why is it being presented to a lot of us? You have to look at who's presenting it. Look at all of the websites that are presenting this document, and you will find, like Talking Drum, you'll find it's mostly African American people who are promoting it, who are distributing it. I haven't found out who wrote it, a specific person. I do have some suspicions about. I can probably give you a profile of the writer. I can give you a profile, but I've been trying to find out who actually wrote the document, right? And I would suspect that it was probably written no earlier than the late 80s. No earlier than the late 80s. Because I was trying to remember when I actually first saw it. But it might have been late 80s. Someone said around 1993. But I'm not really so sure about that. Because it seems like I remember seeing it earlier. But the people are, why, the question is, why are people distributing this? Now, there's an article written by, I forget the professor's name. I had his or her name down, I'm not sure. But there was an article written that really breaks down the letter or the speech and talks about why, points out some of the things I'm pointing out as to why it's wrong. And some people responded to that essay this person did and said, there were some people who said, well, thanks for giving us this information. I already suspected that it was fabricated. Then others said, well, I didn't know it was fabricated, but now you pointed that out to me. And then there was a third group of people who said, well, it is true. What are you talking about? And among them, there was others who said, it might not be true, it might not be fake, but it's true. Right? What do you think they mean by that? The letter might be fake, but what's true? What he's talking about? Okay. Well, here's what's not true. And here's what... the letter gives us the impression that that the problems African Americans face were instituted by a diabolical plan, right? And my problem with that is that really reinforces the idea of white supremacy, right? Even though he is depicted as this demon, he still has to be a godlike genius to come up with a plan like that that has repercussions that transcend generations, right? Just told you the symptoms of the Willie Lynch syndrome. The symptoms of the Willie Lynch syndrome are these. These are the problems I have with it. One, that people embrace these things, when they embrace their embrace of this document, like Denzel has done. And I respect Denzel as an actor and everything. He just, clearly he's not a scholar, but I respect him as an actor. I respect Farrakhan and Sharpton. I think they're intelligent people. But in this case, I think they dropped the ball by promoting this thing. Believing in this letter shows a disturbing lack of critical thinking and a weak knowledge base. That's one of the big problems, right? For one to buy it, you have to have no familiarity with African American history. Because if you knew the history of lynching, you would know right away that it was not associated with any action against slaves, right? And if you knew that, and if you had critical thinking skills, you would know that any document that you read, it ought to have some reference to some historical document. We ought to find somewhere some mention of Willie Lynch outside of the Willie Lynch speech or the Willie Lynch letter. I haven't found any mention of him anywhere, and if somebody finds it outside of the connection to this speech, I will give you, Professor Guillory will give you $100. I got your back. So if you do find that, let me know. But no reference whatsoever. So, but a critical reader would have automatically picked that up. A critical reader may have had some trouble with the language there. Those frozen psychological states and using the word nigger every time it mentions it mentions a black person. And because it was just overused to the point where it looked like someone was trying to make this person sound like a rabid racist, and it was just overdone, right? So, what disturbs me is that lack of critical thinking skills. The other thing that disturbs me is by more people know about Willie Lynch than they know about Carter G. Woodson, okay, or about Frederick Douglass. Okay, and there we have documents by other historical figures, other figures who have been through slavery, who actually talk about the tactics of the slave master. Right, Frederick Douglass, in one of his narratives, talks about the tactics of slave masters. One of the things he talks about is how during holidays they would encourage their slaves to drink, and celebrate, to kind of get their, in other words, drug them up, in order for them to forget about the troubles that they're dealing with, and also make them more submissive and more addicted. And there's been a history of that where people have tried to narcotize other people. It happened with Native Americans as well. So you had those kinds of things happening, and you can go to these writers who documented their experience and learn about that. Why create somebody, make up somebody to try to show what's true? I mean, if the point is to show, I'm really trying to show something that's true, so that's why I'm doing it. Then why not go to the real source, right? And some people, and of course, the people who promote and disseminate this letter and who pass it on and say, hey, brother, you need to read this. Those people they're trying to do that because their idea is to wake people up. And they'll tell you, we need to wake up, here, read this, right? And so when they do that, some of them may find out that it's falsified after hearing me or somebody else, and they may say to you, well, still it's going to wake people up, so it's good to send it out, right? Now, here's the problem with that. You're using a lie to promote a greater truth, right? That's the idea, right? If you don't have a problem with someone doing that, then you shouldn't say anything bad about George Bush ever again, right? Because he started a war on false pretenses, but a lot of people say, well, at least he got something. There was something accomplished from it, I don't know. I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying that some people will say, well, his justification was, well, yeah, our information was false, but hey, we did something good. We should have done it anyway, So, of course, that is wrong to justify an action, a wrong action, because of the end results, right? Even though, by the way, yes, I do believe the end results were bad as well, as far as that war is concerned. But in this case, I don't think you should justify trying to enlighten people about slavery by picking a falsified character. You can do that. People do that, though. They do that when they call it novels, though, when they do it, right? In novels you can talk about, huh?
the Bible is a novel when it talks about Satan?
Yep.
In the beginning?
Well, it's not a novel. No, there's another classification of that. That is sacred literature. That's what that's called. Yes. But that's a whole different topic. No, that's sacred literature is what I'll call that. But I'm talking about when people write. There are a lot of novels about slavery or about other issues that illustrates, like, they can illustrate racial conflict, they can illustrate slavery and all that stuff, but they build it around fictional characters. That's cool, but you do it, you label it fiction, right? You don't create somebody and say, oh, this is a historical document, and it's not. Okay? But that's my big problem, is that people will they will study Willie Lynch and learn what Willie Lynch says, who is a made-up person, before they will study, and these are black folks. They will study this made-up white man before they will even look at African American figures, historical figures, and look at their expertise, right? And not their expertise, but their experience and their insight and perspective on the subject. Also, by focusing on this Willie Lynch as a lesson about slavery, it reduces African people to objects rather than actors in their own history, because it emphasizes victimism, right? And I always say this: any discussion about slavery that black folks are involved in ought to focus on the resistance to slavery, okay? Because too many of our people, when they think of slavery, they think about suffering. There are a lot of people who don't know that Africans fought for their freedom, right? In fact, there was a book that was written. It's called The Curse of Willie Lynch, and this writer was one of the things that the writer said. And of course, there was a writer who thinks that this is a true document. But one of the things he said in there, he says. He mentions the Freedmen's Bureau, right? And he said there's a problem with the term freedmen because it implies that these Africans who were enslaved had been freed by someone else. So they didn't even play a part in their own freedom. So this person had really no understanding of history. That is not true at all. He should have read, instead of reading Willie Lynch, he should have read Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a demand, and never has and never will, right? There were no freedoms given to African Americans in this society. People fought for it. And they, since slavery began, been fighting for it. And so a lot of our discussion has to focus on their resistance. And the Willie Lynch letter doesn't give you any, doesn't talk about resistance. Talks about what happened to us and why we are the way we are, right? And connected to that is a reinforcement again of the ideology of white supremacy, right? Because again, this man would have to be supreme for him to dictate and shape the thinking of black folks, right? There was you can't when an abuser abuses a child, for instance, I'm going to use this analogy. A person abuses a child, that can have repercussions not only for that child, but for that child when that child becomes an adult. It will have repercussions for that child's relationship with her child and maybe even a generation afterwards. But the abuser, is not aware of that impact. He doesn't plan that. He just does it, right? So what this Willie Lynch letter gives, the impression it gives us an impression of, again, of white superiority, of almost white godhood, right? Where the white folks are so smart, they came up with a plan that controls everything we do. I'm going to have some news for you. See, the white folks already know this. White folks aren't as smart as you think white folks are. They're not as superiorly, and that's one good thing about integration. When you get to know people and see that they're real and they have different weaknesses that we have. And I said to you before that African Americans have the impressions that African Americans can never be organized. How many people heard that? We can never get together. We're always we just can't get our stuff together, right? And I remember when I was in college, one thing that woke me up to that. One of the things we used to say, man, we need to get ourselves together and be together like the Jewish community. Man, they got their stuff together. We need to do that. Or we say like the Koreans, man, they get together, they put their resources together, and they do their thing, And why can't we do that, And I was surprised. When I was in college, we had a dialogue with some of the Jewish students in the Jewish organization. And I remember talking after one of these meetings, and one of the guys who was the head of this organization, he was talking to me, and he said, when we're in our meetings, we get into arguments and everything, we always try to say, man, why can't we get together and be tight like the black people are? they got it together, So of course that made us laugh because we just were there with a paragon of unity and cultural unity, and so. But it just goes to show you, we have impressions of other people that they are better. They got their things together. You have disunity among black folks, and you have unity among black folks. You have disunity among white folks. You have a lot of disunity among white folks. With any group, you always have that. We do have examples of unity. You look at the Nation of Islam. Look at the development of Atlanta in the 70s and the 80s. If you want to look at as some examples of pooling resources together and among black folks. So there are those examples of that. But because of our perception of our condition, we think our condition is really messed up. And our condition is messed up to an extent, but these are not rooted from somebody's plans. It's rooted in those values: racism, sexism, classism.